Hello again, everybody. So for this video, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to look at the effects that World War I had on the progressive movement in the United States, and how ultimately World War I would lead to kind of a fatigue, if you will, that would ultimately spark a massive backlash against progressive reform by 1920. The good place to start is to kind of really start with President Woodrow Wilson's declaration of war against Germany, or the statement that he put forward in his request that Congress issue a declaration of war, more accurately. Um, Wilson, as I mentioned previously, was deeply reluctant to bring the United States into the First World War. But when he did, he decided he was going to make the best of it, and the way that he was going to do so was by very closely linking together the cause of American success on the battlefield against Germany with the progressive political and social movements back home. He did this by stating in his request for declaration of war, we must make the world safe for democracy. So that one sentence, we must go to war to make the world safe for democracy, very closely links together and ultimately ties together the fortunes of the progressive movement and American victory in the First World War. Now, in the short run, this would prove to be a massive boon for the progressive movement, as it would ultimately help several major progressive causes that have been long simmering in American politics since the 1890s, if not earlier, achieve their final victories. This is particularly true in the case of women's suffrage. Now, women's suffrage had become a mainstream issue in American society by the turn of the 20th century. But it had moved at a very slow pace. The mainstream uh, women's suffrage organization in the United States, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, under the leadership of Carrie Chapman Catt, had adopted a state by state approach, trying to get each individual state to ratify, to allow women to extend the right to vote to women. By 1917, about a little bit shy of 24 states had granted women at least some limited rights to vote in this capacity because of this approach. But ultimately, World War I provided an opportunity for something much more dramatic, a push for an actual constitutional amendment guaranteeing women's suffrage nationwide. And one of the ways that this was promoted quite aggressively was by radical activists like Alice Paul. Now, as I mentioned in a previous video about the progressive movement and Woodrow Wilson, Woodrow Wilson himself was hostile to the idea of women's suffrage when he was first inaugurated in 1913, and in fact, that had led to Alice Paul organizing this mass protest at his inauguration. Um, but World War I provided her and her organization, the National Women's Party, with an even greater opportunity. Because Wilson had explicitly linked American victory in the First World War to the cause of democracy, this allowed her and her fellow activists to point to the basic hypocrisy of the Wilson administration's stance on women's suffrage. After all, the argument went, if you're saying that we're fighting to make the world safe for democracy, how can you then at the same time, with a straight face say that we should deny half of the population, granting half the population the right to vote? And so Paul and other activists sought to draw heightened public attention to this rather glaring hypocrisy on the part of the Wilson administration. And to that end, she and others engaged in very high profile acts of civil disobedience. They chained themselves to the White House fence, got themselves arrested and imprisoned for acting in this manner. And once in prison, Paul and several other activists engaged in a very well publicized and quite dramatic hunger strike that went on for several days, and which ultimately engendered considerable public sympathy, especially when the government ultimately opted to begin force feeding Paul and other activists um, when they continued on their hunger strike for several days. Paul's activities highlighted the basic hypocrisy of the Wilson administration's stance on this issue, and it brought about considerable and increased public sympathy for the issue of women's suffrage. Now, that in of itself is very important, but ultimately, the way that World War I makes the proves to be decisive for women's suffrage is actually in a somewhat much more mundane way. Um, and you could say that this was an easy out for the Wilson administration, depending on how cynically you approach politics. But basically, um, you know, the First World War didn't just call up the actions and the involvement of American men. Although, of course, the draft at the time was exclusively a draft for eligible, military age men. Certainly, large numbers of American women sought to do their part to contribute to the war effort, just as their brothers and husbands and uncles were doing in the front lines in whatever capacity they were allowed to do so. Um, and for millions of American women during World War I, that took the form of taking jobs in factories that had been vacated by male workers in munitions plants, in rifle factories, airplane factories, what have you. When we think of this, we tend to think of World War II and Rosie the Riveter because during World War II it was much more highly publicized. And there's a pretty famous propaganda poster from World War II to highlight this. But just as in World War II, large numbers of American women took jobs in traditionally male occupations to help keep the war effort going and to fill the gaps in the workforce that was created by large numbers of American men either volunteering or being drafted for service in the military. Beyond that, you also had sizable numbers, nowhere near as many as the number of women who took jobs in factories, but still pretty sizable numbers of women volunteered during the war to serve on the front lines as nurses, as ambulance drivers, as telephone operators. Of course, famously, the book A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway is about his doomed romance with an American nurse in Italy during the First World War. So large numbers of American women did in fact volunteer to serve in what capacities they were allowed to on or as near to the front line as they were permitted. And so that combined with the large numbers of American women who stepped up and took jobs in wartime industries that helped keep American factories roaring during the war, coupled with arguably growing political pressure on Wilson himself, ultimately prevailed upon him. And in early 1918, Wilson abruptly changed his tune on women's suffrage, a cause that he had up to that point vehemently resisted. In 1918, he completely reverses his stance on and throws his weight behind supporting the passage of a constitutional amendment to grant women the right to vote. He does so by framing it as a reward for women's wartime contributions to American victory in whatever capacity those were. So arguably, the First World War is very important for spurring the passage of the 19th Amendment, which is voted on by Congress in 1919 and which is ratified by the states the following year in 1920, which then becomes the first presidential election where women are allowed to vote nationwide. So that's one area where the First World War clearly had a direct and ultimately positive effect on the progressive movement and ultimately helped it achieve one of its major goals. Another area where the progressive movement found equal success was one that played upon decidedly different emotions and different motivations than the push for women's suffrage. Whereas the push for women's suffrage had called upon images of wartime sacrifice and patriotism, the push for the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, ultimately won its greatest success principally by playing on a dramatic increase in anti-foreign and specifically anti-German sentiment that the war ginned up. Um, Wartime propaganda during World War One was, as with the case with most propaganda, quite aggressive in portraying America's enemy, Germany, in the most unfavorable light possible. Propaganda posters, movies, plays portrayed Germany as, barbarous. The nickname the Hun, obviously meaning to be a reference to, barbarians of antiquity. And so there's this tendency to, associate anything German with, the opposite of civilization, the opposite of a decent and, you know, good society, if you will. And it's so extensive that not only do some German Americans end up getting lynched because of this, such as Baker Robert Prager, who was actually a baker just across the river in Collinsville, Illinois, who was lynched by a mob in 1917, not because he was a socialist, but because he was a German American, though the fact that he was socialist probably didn't help his cause. Um, the anti-German sentiment was so pervasive in the United States that even war heroes with German surnames, like Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's wartime ace of aces, who shot down 26 German planes over the Western Front in 1918, felt strong pressure to make themselves, to show how, truly American they were by changing the spelling of their surnames to make them less German sounding, replacing the H in his last name Rickenbacker with a K. Um, so that's just one example, one very high profile example, a Medal of Honor recipient, actually. And so, if Medal of Honor recipients are feeling pressure to change their names because they sound too German, that kind of gives you an indication, I think, of how pervasive that anti-German sentiment in fact was. Now, naturally, of course, this is very useful for those who champion prohibition because, well, as people who live in the St. Louis region, you all know, you know, breweries tend to have German names: Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, Miller, etc. And so, by playing deeply into these anti-German, anti-foreign sentiments, the prohibition movement um, had a long history at this point of playing into anti-foreign stereotypes and imagery to try to sell its message of outlawing alcohol. But it really kicks this effort into high gear. Organizations like the Anti-Saloon League and various others really play into the Germanophobia of the period. And it's successful in the end by playing into this anti-German hysteria and this, kind of anti-foreign sentiment that the war gins up. They're able to secure passage of the 18th Amendment, creating prohibition, which would, of course, go on to become one of the most famous features of American life in the 1920s, which we'll talk about the specifics of more in a future video, as well as going down as one of the great failures in American politics, and really a, indication of the whole idea that you can't legislate morality to people. But anyway, so those are two big progressive causes that ultimately see arguably themselves put over the threshold, over the top, if you will, by the American entry into the First World War. And now, the dark side of America's entry into the First World War, and really the central irony of American entry into the First World War, isn't just this intensified anti-German sentiment, which is ultimately weaponized to secure passage of prohibition. But it also finds its way into other avenues of American life. When President Woodrow Wilson, when the First World War was declared started in August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson, one of the reasons why he wanted the U.S. to remain neutral is because he feared that if the United States entered the war, that it would undermine democracy at home, that it would undermine civil liberties and democratic institutions and whatnot. Um, and as it would turn out, that would actually largely prove to be true and would essentially become a self fulfilling prophecy for Wilson during his wartime leadership during World War I. At the same time, American forces are fighting overseas to make the world safe for democracy. We end up seeing in the United States a massive clampdown on civil liberties. This is done ostensibly to prevent espionage and to protect, American assets and what have you from saboteurs and what have you. Um, but the real targets of the laws that are passed by Congress after the United States enters the war, like the Espionage Act of 1917, the Trading with the Enemies Act signed that same year, and the Sedition Act of 1918, the real principal targets of the government during the war aren't people who are engaged in covert, anti, kind of espionage or engaging in sabotage or anything like that. The real targets of the Wilson administration's wrath during World War One and in the years that immediately follow World War One are mainly people who criticize the war through a variety of lenses, specifically socialists like Eugene V. Debs and others who criticize the war, who blame the greed of American corporations for kind of dragging and sucking us into this conflict because of their continuance of wartime trade and things like that, criticizing the draft. So most of the people who end up getting arrested and sent to prison during World War One for violations of the Sedition Act or the Espionage Act or things like that aren't people who are actually, German agents or, conducting any kind of espionage or anything like that. They're just people who criticize the war, who engaged in what generally we would consider to be constitutionally protected forms of dissent and free speech. Um, and so the First World War, again, this war to make the world safe for democracy, ends up resulting in one of the greatest erosions of civil liberties and freedom of dissent in all of American history. And it continues even after the war ends. That anti German sentiment that the war produced, it doesn't that general anti-foreign sentiment doesn't abate when the war ends. It just simply finds new avenues. Now, when World War One ends, things go pretty badly for the American economy once the war actually ends. The war ends rather abruptly in November of 1918, and when the war ends, the Wilson administration pretty much immediately and the government pretty much immediately cancel all outstanding government contracts that have been signed out. It begins, and so as a result, factories begin laying off massive numbers of workers because there's no longer this wartime demand. And to make things even worse, the wartime controls that union activists and progressive organizations had won for American workers during the war, like basic workplace safety guarantees, the 8-hour workday, etc., higher pay. All of these things are undone once the war ends, and industries very quickly seek to revert back to the pre-war standard, which of course was a disaster for working people, was a disaster for working class people in terms of their safety and in terms of their pay and everything else. And to top that all off, you have these millions of people who had been sent to the front lines in France or were awaiting deployment in the United States who suddenly are, booted out of the military, discharged from military service once the war ends, and find themselves having to seek employment at a time when factories are cutting production And so naturally, what this produces is a double whammy of recession and high inflation. And as a result of these two factors, in 1919, the United States ends up being plagued with massive industrial unrest. There are numerous um, work stoppages, several violent strikes, and things look pretty bad from an industrial standpoint because of this growing labor unrest that the post war recession creates. And so naturally, Wilson and other business friendly newspaper editors and politicians and what have you, they begin looking for a scapegoat for all of this new unrest. And so, um, kind of seizing on the anti foreign um, and anti civil liberties campaigns that had materialized during the First World War, they refixed their attention on domestic radicals, groups like the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and they become particularly paranoid and fearful that that there is a plot underfoot in the United States to overthrow the American government and replace it with a communist style government like the one that had recently seized control in Russia in late 1917. So this fear of there being, kind of an American version of a Bolshevik revolution really takes hold in the United States because of this labor unrest. And much of it, of course, is fundamentally focused on the origins of the people who are seen as the most dangerous radicals. The fact that many of the most or the tendency to associate immigrants with radicalism is very strong in the United States. And so that kind of idea of foreign-born boogeymen once again gains widespread acceptance. Another factor that contributes to this in the defense of those who in government who heighten this kind of paranoia is the fact that there is a campaign of a wave of terrorist bombings in the United States in 1919 and 1920, including one on Wall Street that ends up killing 38 people. So as a result of this labor unrest and these bombings and this more kind of broad generalized fear of this sort of, you know, communist revolutionary plot being brought about by Eastern European, specifically Jewish immigrants to the United States, the Justice Department initiates a series of raids. These kick off what is generally known as the first Red Scare in the United States. These raids, which are conducted under the auspices of the Justice Department and ordered by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, become known for obvious reasons as the Palmer raids. But they're actually carried out by a group within the Justice Department known as the Radical Division, led by J. Edgar Hoover, who would then, of course, go on to become the head of the FBI, a position that he would hold for nearly 50 years until his death in 1972. Hoover was a committed anti-communist, but he also recognized the propaganda value of heightening this sort of image of this danger posed by foreign-born radicals. And so, even though the Palmer raids didn't result in the arrest of anybody who was engaged in any actual plot against the United States government or against people or property in the United States, and once again, as in the case with the Haymarket bombings of the 1880s, of 1887, there was nothing linking many of the foreign-born radicals to the kind of mail-in bombing campaign that had swept the U.S. in 1919, 1920. The Justice Department ultimately orders more than 500 of the 6,000 people that they arrest in these raids, including well-known foreign-born radicals like Russian-born feminist and labor activist Emma Goldman, deported from the United States. Again, their principal crime being not that they had engaged in some sort of actual conspiracy against the United States, but rather the fact that they held radical ideas and the fact that they were foreign born. Uh, so the first Red Scare really becomes, in many ways, this way of attacking both dissenting opinions by, shutting down libraries, banning radical publications, um, governmental entities, including the United States Congress, refusing to seat socialist candidates who had won election, um, and linking those things with immigrant populations, specifically Eastern European and Jewish populations. So it's this combination of anti-communist hysteria, um, anti-Semitism, and general xenophobia, all kind of mixed into this toxic brew. And it basically gets official sanction from the Supreme Court in 1919 in the Schenck v. United States decision, which is actually the first decision ever handed down by the Supreme Court that dealt explicitly with the First Amendment. Um, by the by, that decision is still to this day routinely cited in newspaper articles and in kind of general public discourse, even though it has long since been largely overturned because of the expansive powers that it ultimately granted the government to suppress free speech. Um, but the example that was used in that decision is still routinely cited, oftentimes innocently, sometimes not so innocently, in coverage of free speech debates to this day. Basically, the case involved a man a socialist, who had published an anti-war, anti-draft pamphlet during World War I. He was arrested and convicted under the Sedition Act for this. In the Schenck v. U.S. decision, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld his conviction and claimed that speech like that he was engaging in during a time of national emergency posed a, quote, clear and present danger to the United States and therefore was not protected by the First Amendment's guarantee to freedom of speech. The Chief Justice at the time, Oliver Wendell Holmes, made a famous metaphor for this by comparing speech like that Schenck was engaged in to yelling fire in a crowded theater, which again is a metaphor that is still used by people to this day, even though many don't even know what they're referencing when they do it. Um, Ultimately, because of this rather serious erosion of civil liberties that the Schenck decision and laws like the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act and the way that they had been used primarily to suppress dissent during World War I and during the first Red Scare, um, because of this severe erosion of civil liberties, in 1920, a group of lawyers formed a new organization called the American Civil Liberties Union, which dedicated itself to defending freedom of speech. But really, again, this is a episode that really marks a period where we see, again, in spite of the stated demands, stated purpose of the U.S. in fighting the First World War to make the world safe for democracy, American involvement in the First World War from a civil liberties standpoint arguably brings about a period of considerable erosion of basic constitutional liberties as we understand them in the United States. And eventually it proves to be exhausting to the American people. By 1920, a growing sense of disillusionment with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which many see as reaffirming this idea that we had fought World War I not to make the world safe for democracy, but to benefit European colonial and imperial expansion, coupled with the kind of routine outrages and social upheaval caused by the First World War, by the first Red Scare and various other things. eventually people just get tired of progressive reform. And so in 1920, when faced with a choice between reaffirming Wilsonian internationalism and the progressive movement with Democrat James M. Cox, or embracing a quote return to normalcy, the vague promise made by Republican Warren G. Harding, Americans ultimately choose the latter. And Harding wins election. And as a result, the progressive movement in the United States comes to a rather, kind of doesn't go out with a bang. It kind of ends with this, kind of whimper of the 1920 election. Um, a election which really marks the beginning of a rather than progressive but deeply reactionary period in American politics that would eventually come crashing down in the Great Depression that started in 1929. So um, that's pretty much all for that video today. When we get back next week, we will begin looking at the Roaring Twenties, the social and political dynamics of that time period, which again continue to be shaped by the effects of World War One, and we'll look at how that all eventually comes crashing down, leading to the Great Depression.